The wind carried the smell of dust before it carried anything else. Caleb Renner had learned to read that smell the way other men read clouds. Dry dust meant a dying well. Wet dust meant one worth saving. This dust was dry all the way through. He stopped his horse at the top of the rise and looked down at Ashworth Sheep Ranch. 400 head, maybe fewer now, packed close around a trough that had been dry since sunup. A woman stood at the pump handle, working it with both arms, though nothing came up but a thin brown trickle, and then nothing at all. He almost turned the horse around. 3 years was long enough to know the shape of his own fear. It looked exactly like a woman working a dead pump handle, refusing to stop, even after the truth had already arrived. But the letter in his coat pocket had asked only for a look, not a dig, a look. Someone in Larkspur had given her his name. He could give her an hour of honesty and be gone before dark. He rode down. She heard the horse before she saw him and turned with the pump handle still in her hand, like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to put down. Delphine Ashworth was maybe 40, sun-worn at the eyes, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and streaked with rust from the pump. She didn't smile. She didn't offer water because there wasn't any to offer. "You're Renner." "I am." "You took your time answering my letter." "I read it 3 times before I wrote back." He dismounted, keeping the reins loose in his hand. "I want to be clear before I look at anything. I don't dig wells anymore. I look. I tell you what I see. That's what you're getting." Something moved behind her eyes, quick and controlled, gone before it could be named anger or disappointment. "The letter said you were the best driller between here and the territory line." "The letter was written by a man who doesn't know me anymore." She studied him for a long moment, the way a person studies a tool they're not sure is broken or just unfamiliar. Then she set the pump handle down, careful, like it might still be needed later. "Come look, then." The well sat behind the barn, capped with a warped board and a stone that had been rolled over it. Caleb crouched beside it and lowered a stick with his handkerchief tied to the end, listening for the small sound of contact with water far below. He heard nothing. He lowered it further. Still nothing. "How long since it ran clean?" "6 weeks." "How long have you been telling your hands it's temporary?" She didn't answer that, which was its own answer. He sat back on his heels and looked past her toward the sheep, toward the dry creek bed cutting through the property like an old scar. "You've got maybe 11 days of water left in your cistern, if you're rationing hard. Fewer if this heat holds." "I know how to count days, Mr. Renner." "I didn't say you didn't." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "I said it out loud because somebody should. Sounds like nobody has." For the first time, something in her face loosened, just slightly, just at the corners of her mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. "There's a man named Sloan," she said, 3 miles east, who'd very much like me to run out of days. He's offered to buy my water rights twice this year. Both times I told him this ranch doesn't run dry on my watch. And now it's running dry anyway. Now it's running dry anyway." She said it flatly, without asking for sympathy, and he respected that more than he expected to. He walked the perimeter of the well site slowly, the way he used to walk every site before he stopped walking them at all. He noted the slope of the ground, the color of the grass thinning toward the east fence line, the way the old well had been dug too close to the barn's shadow, where the ground never fully dried and rot crept quietly beneath the stone. "Your well's not just dry," he said finally. "It's in the wrong place. Somebody dug it 40 years ago without checking the grade. Water's still down there, it's just moved." "How do you know that and not just guess it?" "I don't guess." He said it simply, no pride in it. "I used to be sure of things. Now I'm careful. There's a difference, and it's taken me 3 years to learn it." She waited, the way people wait when they sense there's more behind a sentence than the sentence itself. He didn't give her more. Not yet. Some things a man didn't hand over on the first afternoon. A boy of about 10 came around the side of the barn then, thin-shouldered, carrying a bucket that was clearly heavier than he was built for. He set it down hard when he saw a stranger, water sloshing over the rim. The last of the cistern water, Caleb guessed, rationed out for the horses. "That's Tam," Dell said. "My sister's boy, staying with me while she's laid up in Cheyenne." Tam looked at Caleb with the particular suspicion of a child who has learned that strangers usually bring bad news dressed as help. He said nothing. He picked the bucket back up, water sloshing again, and carried it toward the horses without being told. Caleb watched him go. Something in the boy's careful, silent effort sat wrong in his chest, familiar in a way he didn't want to examine. "He doesn't talk much," Dell said, following his gaze. "Neither did my boy, once, for a while." Caleb heard himself say it before he'd decided to. He didn't explain further, and she didn't push. The sun was dropping now, throwing long shadows across the dead well. Caleb pulled his hat lower and turned back toward his horse. "I can tell you where to dig," he said. "I can even tell you how deep, near enough. That's a look, same as I promised. What I can't do is put my own hands on the tools and take you down there myself." "Why not?" It was a plain question, asked without cruelty, and it deserved a plain answer he wasn't ready to give. "Because the last well I dug caved before it was finished," he said instead, quieter than he meant to. "My wife was standing where she shouldn't have been, because I told her it was safe. I was wrong about safe." He tightened the cinch on his saddle, giving his hands something to do. "I don't tell people wells are safe anymore. I just tell them where the water is." Dell didn't offer comfort. She didn't reach for him or soften her voice the way some women might have. She simply nodded once, taking the information the way she took everything. Measured, unsentimental, filed away for later use. 11 days, she said. "You said it yourself. I can't hire a new driller and wait for him to ride out from the territory line." "No," Caleb agreed, "you can't. So what happens to my ranch while you decide how careful is careful enough?" He didn't have an answer for that. He mounted his horse instead, looking down at her one more time, at the rust on her sleeves, the dry pump behind her, the boy hauling water like it was the only job left in the world that still meant something. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "I'll mark the ground. That's all I'm promising tonight." "That's more than I had this morning," Dell said. He rode out as the light went orange and low across the dead creek bed, and he did not look back, though some part of him wanted to. Caleb came back before sunrise, the way he'd said he would, and marked the new site with 4 wooden stakes and a length of twine full taut between them. He did not touch a shovel. He simply crouched at each corner, testing the soil with his fingers, checking the pull of morning dew where it beaded thin and reluctant on the grass. 40 feet east of the old well, he told Dell, who stood watching with her arms crossed, Tam a few steps behind her holding the twined spool without being asked. "Maybe 60 feet down. The water's there. I'd stake my name on it." "Would you stake your hands on it too?" He didn't answer that. He rolled the twine back onto its spool instead and handed it to Tam, who took it carefully, like something breakable. What he did agree to was smaller, the trough, the pump housing, cracked at its base where 3 summers of dry heat had shrunk the wood away from the iron fittings. A man could fix a trough without anyone's life resting on whether he'd read the ground right. He told himself that on the ride out, and again on the ride back the next morning, and it held up both times, so he kept telling it to himself. He worked through the week that way. Small repairs, nothing that asked more of him than steady hands and a level eye. He replaced the warped boards on the barn door that let wind steal warmth in winter and dust in summer. He reset the fence posts along the east line, the ones closest to Sloan's property, where the wire had gone slack enough that sheep wandered where they shouldn't. Dell worked beside him more often than not, and Tam trailed after both of them, watching, learning the names of tools before he learned to trust the man holding them. Sloan rode in on the fourth day. He came alone, which Dell said later was its own kind of message. A man secure enough not to need company, or a man who didn't want witnesses to what he was about to say. He was younger than Caleb expected, maybe 35, dressed better than the land around him deserved, and he smiled the whole time he spoke, which made the words underneath it colder. 11 days, Mrs. Ashworth. I heard it from 3 different mouths in town, so I expect it's close to true. He didn't dismount. My offer's still open. Better than open. Improved. I'll take the water rights and the east pasture both, and you keep the house and enough land to run a smaller flock. You wouldn't have to watch your stock die of thirst in front of you. I've got a driller working on a new well, Dell said. Sloan's eyes moved to Caleb, standing at the fence with a hammer still in his hand. Renner. He said it like he already knew the name, and maybe he did. Drillers' names travel fast in dry country. Heard you don't dig anymore. Heard you just look. That's right. Must be a comfort to Mrs. Ashworth, having a man mark stakes in her yard while her sheep go dry. Sloan's smile didn't move. I'll be back in a week. The offer gets smaller every time I have to ride out here. He turned his horse and left without waiting for a response, which was, Caleb thought, its own kind of answer to a question nobody had asked. That evening, after Tam had gone to bed and the ranch had settled into the particular quiet of a place with too little water and too much worry, Dell found Caleb sitting on the porch step, turning something small over in his hands. What's that? He almost didn't answer. Then he opened his palm and let her see it. A brass compass, its casing worn smooth at the edges, the glass face scratched but still readable. Not the kind a man used for direction. The kind a driller used to true a bore, to keep a shaft running straight and honest through 50 feet of dark ground. My wife gave it to me, he said, before the well that killed her. She used to say a straight shaft was a kind of promise, that if a man dug true, the ground would hold up its end. He closed his hand over it again. I haven't used it since. Dell sat down beside him, not too close. Close enough. You still carry it, though. Can't seem to put it down. Can't seem to pick it back up, either. He almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. 3 years, and I've got a compass in my pocket and no well behind my name. If you've ever carried something you couldn't use and couldn't let go of either, you already know exactly what that feels like. Tell us in the comments what yours was. Dell didn't offer him comfort dressed up as advice, and he was grateful for that more than he could have said. She simply held out her hand, palm up, waiting, the way she'd waited at the pump the first day he'd ridden in. Let me hold it then, she said. Just for a while. A man can't lose something he's given away to keep safe. He looked at her palm for a long moment. Then he placed the compass in it, and her fingers closed around the brass, and something in his chest loosened that he hadn't known was clenched. I'm not asking you to dig, she said. I know what that well cost you. I'm only asking you to think about it as something other than a debt you can't pay back. That's a fine line to walk. I've been walking fine lines since Sloan's first offer. She turned the compass over once in her hand, studying the scratched glass. This ranch has 11 days, Caleb. Maybe fewer. I don't have the luxury of a man who takes his time deciding what he's afraid of. No, he admitted. You don't. They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't ask to be filled. Somewhere behind the barn, the sheep shifted and settled, restless with thirst even in sleep. Dell kept the compass closed in her hand long after Caleb had gone quiet beside her, and neither of them moved to end the evening before it was ready to end itself. The cistern ran dry on the 9th day, 2 days earlier than Caleb had counted, because a hot wind came up from the south and burned through what little reserve they had left. By noon, the trough was dust. By evening, the sheep had stopped bleating and gone quiet in a way that worried Dell more than any noise could have. "That's the bad kind of quiet," she said, standing at the fence with Caleb beside her, watching the flock pressed together in whatever shade the barn threw. "They quiet down like that, right before they start dying." "How many days can they hold without water?" 3, maybe 4 if this heat breaks. She didn't look at him. "It won't break." Tam came out from the barn carrying the last full bucket, the very last of it, and set it in front of the nearest ewe without being told which one needed it most. He'd learned that much this week, which animals could wait and which couldn't. Caleb watched him work and felt something twist hard in his chest, because the boy's careful, exhausted competence was a smaller version of something he recognized too well. That night, Dell laid it out plain, the way she laid out everything. "I need the well dug, Caleb. Not marked, not looked at. Dug. I need it started tomorrow, and I need it finished before Sloan rides back with an offer I can't afford to refuse a third time. I told you from the first day. I know what you told me." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't soften either. "You told me you look and you don't dig. I respected that, because I understood it was a wall you'd built for a reason. But walls don't feed sheep, and they don't keep a 10-year-old boy from watching every animal on his place die of thirst, because a man who could help him decided his own fear mattered more than that." The words landed exactly where she meant them to. Caleb stood very still, the compass a small, hard weight in the pocket where it had lived since she'd given it back to him 2 nights before, quietly, without ceremony, after he hadn't asked for it and hadn't refused it either. "That's not fair," he said, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. "No," Dell agreed, "it isn't. Fair would be you never having lost her. Fair would be this drought never happening. We're a long way past fair, Caleb. We're down to what's left." He turned and looked out at the dark shape of the barn, the dry well behind it, the new stakes he'd driven into the ground a week ago and not touched since. "You don't understand what it is to stand at the edge of a shaft and know that the last time you told someone it was safe, it wasn't. You don't know what that does to a man's hands." "You're right. I don't." She said it without apology. "But I know what it is to stand at a dry trough and watch my flock quiet down like they're already dying. And I know what it is to have a boy in my house who's already lost one home and is about to lose the only steady ground he's got left. I don't have the room left to carry your fear for you, Caleb. I've got my own to carry." He had no answer for that. He walked away from her without meaning to be cruel about it, out past the barn to where the stakes stood in a square of moonlight, and he stood there a long time with his hand in his pocket, closed around the compass, not taking it out. He thought of Lydia, not the version of her the grief had worn smooth over 3 years, not the soft, sorrowful shape he carried around like a stone in his coat, but the actual woman, practical and unafraid, who had stood at the edge of that shaft because he'd told her the bracing was sound, and who had believed him because believing him had never once been a mistake before that day. "I was wrong once," he thought. "I have been telling myself that means I will always be wrong." It wasn't the same thought as forgiveness. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing very close to something sharp and choosing, for the first time in 3 years, not to flinch away from it. He went back to the house near midnight. Dell was still on the porch, not sleeping, the compass nowhere in sight. She'd have put it somewhere safe, he knew, the way she put everything that mattered. "I can't promise you I'll be right," he said. "That's the truth of it. I can't promise the shaft won't shift or the water table won't lie to me the way it lied before. I don't have that kind of certainty left in me." "I'm not asking for certainty." Dell stood, facing him in the dark. "I'm asking you to dig anyway, knowing you might be wrong. That's the only kind of promise that ever meant anything on this land." He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since he'd ridden down that first rise and smelled dry dust on the wind, he let himself imagine finishing something instead of only marking where it should begin. "Tomorrow," he said, "first light, I'll need Tam to run the windlass. He'll want to run more than that. Then he can learn the rest too." Caleb's voice was rough but steady. "Slowly, careful. That's the only way I know how to do it anymore." Dell nodded, and something passed between them that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite trust yet either. Something closer to the first true state driven into hard, uncertain ground. Neither of them noticed until much later that neither had mentioned Sloan at all that night. The well had stopped being about him. It had become, somewhere in the dark between the porch and the barn, about something neither of them was ready to name out loud. They broke ground before the sun cleared the ridge. Caleb worked the way he used to work before Lydia died. Steady, deliberate, checking the bracing twice before trusting it once. Except now every motion carried the weight of 3 years he'd spent refusing to make it. Tam manned the windlass rope, small hands wrapped twice around the crank the way Caleb had shown him, feeding the bucket down and hauling spoil up in a rhythm that steadied the boy's breathing even as it strained his arms. By midday they'd gone 20 feet. By evening, 35, the walls holding true, the compass riding in Caleb's breast pocket though he hadn't needed to check it once, some instinct older than fear guiding his hands instead. Dell kept a sheep alive on what remained of the cistern's last inches, rationed out cup by cup, and said nothing about how thin that margin had grown. On the second day, Sloan rode in early, before they'd even started, and found the shaft already 35 feet deep, with fresh spoil piled beside it. "Digging in a hurry," he said, looking down into the dark of it. "Hurry's what kills men in shafts, Renner. I'd have thought you, of all people, knew that." Caleb didn't rise to it. "I know it better than most. My offer's still on the table. Better yet, I'll throw in enough water from my own reserve to hold your flock until this well of yours either pays out or caves in on you." Sloan's smile hadn't changed since the first day. "Whichever comes first." "Get off my land," Dell said, and there was nothing measured left in her voice at all. Sloan left, unhurried, the way a man leaves when he believes time is doing his work for him. That night the wind changed. It came up fast out of the northwest, dry and hot, and by the time Caleb woke to the sound of it, dust was already sheeting sideways across the yard, hard enough to sting skin. He ran for the shaft on instinct before he'd even reasoned out why, and found the danger not in the wind, but in what the wind had loosened. A crack running along the north wall of the bore, opened by 2 days of digging through ground gone brittle with drought. The kind of crack that widened with vibration and time, and had no patience for either. Dell was already there, a lantern in one hand, staring down into the dark. "Sam's rope slipped an hour ago," she said, voice tight. "He went down after the bucket himself. I told him to wait for morning. He didn't listen." Caleb looked down into the shaft. 35 feet below, in the wavering lantern light, he could see the boy pressed against the far wall, one hand braced on a support beam that was no longer entirely plumb. Dust sifting down around him in a thin, steady rain that was about to become something worse. Every instinct in him said to freeze. He felt it rise in his chest exactly the way it had risen 3 years ago. The certainty that his hands would be wrong again, that the ground would take what he loved most the moment he trusted it. "I was wrong once," he thought again, the way he'd thought it 2 nights before. "I have been telling myself that means I will always be wrong." He tied the rope around his own waist without a word, checked the knot twice the way Lydia had taught him, and handed the other end to Dell. "Feed it slow," he said. 3 tugs means stop. 2 means pull. She caught his eyes for 1 instant before he went over the edge, and there was no fear in her face at all, only the same measured trust she'd shown him the very first day, when she'd handed her child's water bucket to a stranger without asking twice whether he could carry the weight. The descent was the longest 35 feet of his life. Dust rained harder as he went, the crack widening above him with a low groan that ran through the ground like something breathing. He reached Tam just as the support beam gave a half inch, no more, but enough to send a fresh cascade of dirt down the north wall. "I've got you," Caleb said, low and even, the way he used to speak to men in shafts before he'd stopped trusting his own voice to promise anything. "Hold on to me. Don't look up. Don't count the dirt." Tam's hands found his shirt and held on hard enough to bruise. Caleb gave the rope 2 sharp tugs, and Dell began to haul, both of them rising together as the wall behind them shed another sheet of loosened earth, close enough that Caleb felt it brush his boot on the way past. They broke the surface into the full fury of the wind, and Dell pulled them both the last few feet onto solid ground with strength Caleb hadn't known she had. And then the 3 of them lay together in the dust as the north wall of the shaft finished its collapse below. 35 feet of careful work folding in on itself in the dark. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Tam was shaking, and Caleb held on to him without thinking twice about whether it was his place to. "The well's gone," Dale said finally, staring at the ruined shaft. "The well can be dug again," Caleb answered. "In a better place, with better bracing. Slower this time." He looked at Tam, still gripping his shirt. "The boy isn't gone. That's the only count that matters tonight." Dell looked at him across the dust and the wreckage of 2 days' work, and something settled in her face that hadn't been there before. Not relief exactly, but the particular quiet of a person who has just watched someone else's fear break and hold anyway. "You went down there believing it might fall," she said. "I went down there anyway." Caleb's voice was rough with dust and something else. "That's the only kind of promise I've got left to give." The new well stood 40 yards north of the old one, on higher ground Caleb had chosen this time, not by instinct alone, but by instinct tested twice against careful measure. The way he'd come to understand, good work was always meant to be done. It had taken until October to finish it properly, bracing checked 3 times over, the shaft sunk true and slow, and it had not failed once since the day it began to run. Sloan's offers stopped coming sometime around the 2nd week of steady water. A man had less use for drought when a neighbor no longer had any left to sell him. Dell never spoke of that night in the shaft as though it had changed anything between them, and in a way it hadn't. It had only made plain what had already been true for weeks. She kept the ranch running the way she always had, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, and Caleb kept fixing things that needed fixing, no longer drawing a line between the repairs that cost him nothing and the ones that cost him everything. 1 year on, almost to the day, Dell's sister came to collect Tam, healthy now and talking more than anyone at the ranch had thought he ever would again. He cried leaving the well he'd nearly died in and dearly loved anyway, and Dell promised him summers and meant it. That same afternoon, with the ranch quiet and the sheep grazing fat and unhurried near a trough that never ran dry, Dell walked out to where Caleb sat mending a fence post and pressed something small and brass into his palm. "I kept it safe," she said, "same as I promised." Caleb turned the compass over once, its scratched glass catching the low autumn light, and for the first time in 4 years, he did not feel the old weight settle into it. He felt only the shape of a promise he had finally learned how to keep. "I don't need to carry it anymore," he said, and held it back out to her. "I'd rather it belonged to something that's still being built." Dell didn't take it back. Instead, she called Tam over, one last time before the wagon came, and placed the compass in the boy's hands, closing his small fingers around the brass, the way her own had once closed around it on a dark porch in a summer that had nearly cost them everything. "A straight shaft is a kind of promise," she told him, echoing words she'd never spoken, but somehow already knew belonged to this place. "If you dig true, the ground will hold up its end. Tam looked down at the compass, then up at Caleb, who nodded once, the way a man nods when a debt has finally, quietly, been paid in full. The wagon came at dusk. The well kept running long after it disappeared over the rise, steady and clear, exactly the way water is supposed to run when someone has finally trusted the ground enough to dig deep and stay.